Imagine, for just a second, imagine a global televised race.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
You've got nearly 200 runners lining up, and they're representing every single nation on Earth, right?
Right.
And they were all sprinting around this colossal, just never-ending track.
Like an ultra marathon.
Exactly, like an infinite ultramarathon.
Right.
And for decades, I mean, really, for the entirety of modern history, the rules of this specific race have been incredibly straightforward.
Run as fast as you can.
Run as fast as you can. The faster you run, the richer your country gets, the more factories you build, the higher you climb up on that global leaderboard.
Yeah, it's a pure, unadulterated race for raw economic growth.
Right. But then, right in the middle of this sprint, the judges suddenly blow the whistle.
They pause the race.
They pause the whole thing, and they announce this completely unprecedented rule change. They look at all the runners panting and sweating and say, listen, we are no longer just judging you on your speed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, from this exact moment on, we're going to actively penalize you if your running shoes are tearing up the track.
That is a massive shift.
It changes everything. They say, if you are destroying the very ground that we all need to run on, your score is going to plummet. So if you change the fundamental rules of the game like that overnight, what do you think happens to that leaderboard?
Well, I mean, it completely flips.
Right.
It would be utter chaos for the traditional champions of the world. Because the runners who have been celebrated for decades as the undeniable winners of global development.
The naturalized ones.
Exactly. The ones with the biggest industrial engines, the most factories, the highest levels of consumption. They suddenly find themselves crashing down the ranks.
Because they've been chewing up the asphalt this whole time.
Precisely. And conversely, you'd have these runners who are maybe quietly pacing themselves, making these efficient, calculated strides without destroying the track. They suddenly rocket to the front of the pack.
And that vivid image, that complete upheaval of how we rank success, that is exactly what brings us to the core of today's deep dive.
It's such a fascinating topic.
It really is. We are looking at this massive stack of demographic data from the 2023 Global Human Development Index. And we are specifically zooming in on a country that has managed to pull off, honestly, one of the most fascinating developmental magic tricks of the modern era.
We are talking about Chile.
We are talking about Chile. Because when you look at the standard 2023 index, the old rules of the race Chile ranks a very respectable 46th out of 203 countries.
Which is solid.
It's very solid. But when we adjust that exact same score for the ecological pressure they put on the planet, when we apply that track destruction penalty we just talked about, Chile doesn't just bump up like a spot or two.
No, it's a huge leap.
It rockets up to 16th place globally.
Wow.
Yeah, 16th. That is a 30-rank leap.
Which is just an absolute paradigm shifter of a statistic. I mean, a 30-place jump in a global index of this magnitude, it isn't just some statistical quirk, right? It's not a rounding error.
No, you don't jump 30 spots by accident.
Exactly. It is a blaring siren telling us that our fundamental historically accepted definition of what it actually means to be a developed nation is undergoing this radical and, frankly, completely necessary evolution.
Right. Because we are so culturally conditioned to see economic growth coupled directly with environmental degradation.
The assumption has always been a grim one. You want to build a hospital, you have to burn the planet. You want to fund a modern university, you have to clear-cut a forest.
But Chile's data suggests something incredibly disruptive to that traditional Western narrative.
It really does.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because my immediate reaction, and I'm sure the reaction of a lot of people listening right now, is maybe a bit of skepticism. Let me just play devil's advocate here early on.
Please do. That's how we get to the truth of the data.
Right. So when I hear about a new index that magically boosts a developing nation 30 spots overnight, part of me wonders, is this just a way to artificially punish rich, industrialized Western nations?
Ah, the participation trophy argument.
Yeah. Are we just handing out participation trophies to countries that haven't fully industrialized yet? Like, is this actually a real measure of human thriving, or is it just carbon accounting disguised as human development?
That is exactly the right question to ask. And it is the exact skepticism we need to bring to the table today because, let's be honest, it is very easy to manipulate numbers to tell a feel-good story.
It happens all the time.
It really does. But what we are going to do today is look at the hard, unvarnished data from 1990 all the way to 2023. We are going to strip away the assumptions and look at the actual mechanics of how a society functions.
So we're looking at the raw numbers.
The raw numbers. because the data shows that Chile isn't getting a participation trophy. They are achieving genuinely world-class outcomes in human longevity, in education, and in wealth creation. But they are doing it with a fundamentally different ecological blueprint than the nations that came before them.
So our mission for this deep dive is to sort through this mountain of data to answer one core question for you, the listener. Why does quote-unquote high development not always mean true progress?
It's a vital question.
It is. And to do that, we're going to start with the most basic tool we have. We'll get to the environmental stuff, the inequality, the gender dynamics, all of that is coming later. But first, we really need to understand the baseline.
The foundation.
Right. So I want you to introduce us to the standard HDI, the Human Development Index. What exactly is it measuring, and why is it the gold standard for this kind of conversation?
Sure. So think of the standard HDI as a basic medical X-ray for a country.
An X-ray.
Okay. Before the 1990s, if you wanted to know how a country was doing, economists just looked at gross domestic product, GDP.
Right, just looking at the money.
Exactly. How much money did the country make? But money is a terrible proxy for human well-being. A country can be incredibly rich, but if all its citizens are sick and uneducated, is it really developed?
Not at all.
So the United Nations Development Program created the HDI to look at three fundamental biological and social realities. First, how long do people live? Second, how much education do they get? And third, what is their standard of living measured by income per capita?
So it's life, knowledge, and wealth.
Exactly. It gives you the broad skeletal structure of a nation's well-being. That's why I call it an X-ray. It asks the basic questions. Are your people surviving? Are they learning? And do they have the resources to feed themselves?
Right, so it moves the conversation away from just counting dollars in a national bank account to actually measuring human potential. And as we go through this, I really want you, the listener, to think about how you measure success in your own life or your own career.
It's a great parallel.
Is your personal definition of success just about raw growth? You know, earning more money, getting a bigger title, expanding your output year over year? Or do you measure it by how sustainable it is?
Are you burning yourself out to get that promotion?
Exactly. Are you neglecting your physical health or the people around you? Because the journey we are about to take through this global data is essentially that exact same human struggle. The tension between pure growth and long-term sustainability just played out on a massive macroeconomic planetary scale.
It's the perfect way to frame it. And to truly understand the tension of the current moment we're in, we really have to establish the global baseline. We need to rewind the clock to 1990.
Because you can't appreciate a country's current speed unless you know where the starting line was.
Exactly. You need the context.
So paint that picture for us. If we pull the global HDI data from 1990, what does the world actually look like?
In 1990, the global HDI was sitting at exactly 0.608.
0.608.
Right. Now, isolated numbers can be really dry, so let's translate that 0.608 into human reality.
Please do.
A score in that range reflects a world where basic survival is still the primary, all-consuming daily challenge for a massive portion of humanity. Life expectancy globally was hovering right in the mid-60s.
Wow, just the mid-60s.
Yeah. That means a huge segment of the global population simply wasn't living to see retirement or old age. And the mean years of schooling, which is the actual time an average adult had spent in a classroom, was less than 6 years.
Less than 6 years. So they aren't even finishing middle school.
They barely finished elementary school. You're talking about a global reality where the average adult had to enter the workforce as a child, often doing grueling manual labor.
That is a stark reality. Less than 6 years of school on average. But from that 1990 baseline, looking at the charts, we witnessed what essentially amounts to a relentless, almost miraculous 30-year march upward.
It was a continuous climb.
Yeah, I'm looking at the timeline right now. And year after year, the global HDI just kept ticking up. I mean, we had localized wars, we had the dot-com bust, we had the devastating 2008 global financial crisis.
Right. Major global shock.
Major shocks.
Yeah.
But the aggregate score of human development just kept climbing anyway. It felt like this comforting, almost gravitational law of modern human history. Things generally just get better.
The arc of history bending upward.
Exactly. By 2019, the global score had climbed from that 0.608 all the way to 0.745. People were universally living longer, they were staying in school much longer, and they were earning significantly more money.
It was, by all accounts, the golden era of globalization and poverty reduction.
But then
But then we hit a wall, and we didn't just bump into it, we crashed into it at full speed.
The COVID-19 pandemic.
Exactly. And what the HDI data shows us about the pandemic is profoundly unsettling. For the first time since the UN began calculating this index, global human development didn't just slow down, it flatlined, and then it actively went backward.
Wow.
In 2020 and 2021, the global HDI dropped back down to 0.742.
Now, to a layperson, dropping from 0.745 to 0.742, it sounds like a rounding error.
It sounds tiny.
It sounds totally insignificant. But context is everything here, right?
Mm,
We are talking about an index that aggregates the lifespan, the education, and the economic survival of 8 billion people.
right,
So a drop of that magnitude,
right.
what does that actually look like on the ground?
It is a catastrophic reversal. On the ground, it represents millions of lives cut short prematurely by a virus. It represents tens of millions of children who are pushed out of the school system overnight and, in many developing regions, simply never returned.
They just join the workforce permanently.
Exactly. It represents small businesses shuttered, informal economies completely paralyzed, and a massive sudden spike in extreme poverty.
Which raises a really important question about the systems we've built. We spent 30 years marching upward. We survived the 2008 financial collapse without the overall HDI going backward. So why did this specific biological event break the trend so violently?
What's fascinating here is what this reversal teaches us about the illusion of resilience.
The illusion of resilience.
Yeah. We had spent 3 decades building this incredibly tall, highly optimized tower of global human development. But the pandemic revealed that the tower was built almost entirely without shock absorbers.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
The continuous upward trend masked a profound systemic fragility. For example, think about our global supply chains. They were optimized for maximum efficiency and just-in-time delivery.
Which is great for corporate profits.
It's fantastic for profits, but it made those systems incredibly brittle. If a single port in Asia shut down, hospitals in Europe ran out of basic protective gear within days.
Right.
Our public health systems were optimized for routine care and elective surgeries, but they were easily, almost instantly overwhelmed by a systemic shock. The fact that a single biological event could wipe out years of human development progress in a matter of months proves that our global resilience was highly, highly superficial.
It's a deeply sobering thought. We prioritize speed and efficiency over durability. Now, looking at the newest data we have, the 2023 figures show that the global HDI has actually ticked back up.
Yes, it has.
We are 0.756. So, strictly statistically speaking, we have recovered to slightly above pre-pandemic levels. But I look at that recovery, and I can't help but think of an analogy.
That's that.
It feels exactly like what happens when you drop your smartphone in water. You panic, you dry it out in a bag of rice for 2 days, and then you plug it in. The screen lights up, and the battery icon says 100% charged.
Okay, yeah.
So on paper, visually, the phone is fine. But you and I both know that the internal chemistry of that battery has been permanently altered by the water damage.
Right, it's never the same.
Its actual capacity to hold a charge is compromised. The moment you open 3 apps at once, the battery plummets to 20%. So looking at this global recovery, are we actually stronger now as a global community, or are we just patching holes and hoping we don't have to open too many apps at once?
That is a brilliant way to frame it. And unfortunately, the underlying demographic data suggests we are largely just patching holes. The numerical recovery to 0.756 is driven heavily by the resumption of basic economic activity.
People just going back to work.
Exactly, going back to work and the physical reopening of schools. But the underlying vulnerabilities have absolutely not been cured.
The internal water damage.
Precisely. The glaring inequities in global vaccine distribution, the widening wealth gaps that were exacerbated by post-pandemic inflation, the unseen strain on global mental health, and the massive educational deficits in young children, those are the internal water damage. The battery is degraded, we've recovered the headline number, but we haven't fundamentally rebuilt the structural integrity underneath it.
Which brings us perfectly to our focal point today. Because while the global battery is struggling to hold a charge, there is a country down in South America that has been operating like a highly efficient dual-cell power bank.
Let's talk about Chile.
Let's shift our focus entirely to the Chilean miracle. Let's trace Chile's HDI journey. Because looking at this data, they are frankly the honor roll student of their region.
They absolutely are.
In 1990, when the world was at 0.608, Chile was already sitting at 0.718.
So they already had a significant head start.
They started with an advantage. But over the next 3 decades, they didn't just coast on that advantage, they hit the accelerator hard. By 2023, their HDI soared to an incredibly impressive 0.878.
And to give that 0.878 some necessary context, that score firmly ejects Chile from the developing conversation. It places them in the top tier of the UN's classifications, the very high human development category.
The top tier.
Yeah. They are statistically rubbing shoulders with the wealthiest nations in Europe and North America. And to understand how they achieve this, we need to dissect those 3 foundational pillars of the X-ray we talked about earlier.
Right. Health, education, and wealth.
Exactly.
So let's start with health, or as we can think of it, the resilience of life.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, looking at these numbers from the source material, they're just phenomenal. And I don't use that word lightly.
The life expectancy data is staggering.
In 2023, life expectancy at birth in Chile reached 81.7 years. Let me repeat that for everyone listening.
Yeah.
Over 81 years. The global average, remember, is roughly 73.38 years.
Yeah.
So a baby born in Chile today is statistically expected to live nearly 8 full years longer than the average global citizen.
An 8-year differential is practically an entire extra chapter of a human life.
Exactly. That's the difference between knowing your grandchildren as infants and actually seeing them graduate from high school.
Yeah.
And when you split that data by gender, the numbers get even more pronounced.
How so?
Well, Chilean women have a life expectancy of 83.08 years, while men are sitting at 79.24.
And here's where we need to ask the crucial question. Why? An 8-year advantage over the global average does not happen by geographical accident.
No, definitely not.
And it certainly doesn't happen overnight. It tells a profound story about the targeted efficiency of Chile's public health policies over the last 3 decades.
Well, let's explore that, because Chile is geographically insane.
It's a very unique shape.
It's a ribbon of land.
Yeah.
It's squeezed between the towering Andes Mountains and the Pacific Ocean. You've got the driest desert in the world, the Atacama in the north, and literally glaciers in the south. How do you build a healthcare system that delivers an 81-year life expectancy in a country that is a logistical nightmare?
You do it through aggressive, unglamorous, long-term investments in the biological baseline of your citizens. In the 1990s, the Chilean government didn't just build shiny, state-of-the-art hospitals in the capital, Santiago.
Right, which is what a lot of developing countries do for the prestige.
Exactly. Instead, they focused heavily on sanitation. They focused on ensuring clean drinking water access reached remote, rural areas. They implemented incredibly robust, universal childhood vaccination programs. And perhaps most importantly, they built a highly structured primary care network.
What does that look like in practice?
It means instead of waiting for people to get deathly ill and come to an emergency room, they deployed community health clinics to manage care at the local level.
So they focused on preventative infrastructure rather than just reactive medicine.
Precisely. In the 90s and early 2000s, this approach dramatically reduced infant mortality. And mathematically, reducing infant deaths is the fastest way to boost a country's overall average life expectancy.
Because it pulls the average way down if babies don't survive.
Exactly. But the true test of a healthcare system is what happens next. As your population stops dying in infancy, they grow old, and then they start developing complex, chronic, age-related diseases.
Like diabetes, heart disease, cancer.
Exactly. Many developing nations fail at this transition. Their systems are built for acute care, not chronic care. But Chile successfully managed the pivot to treating those chronic conditions, which is how they pushed that life expectancy number past the 80-year mark.
It's a triumph of sustained public policy.
Okay.
Let's look at the second pillar of their X-ray. The deepening of knowledge, the education metrics.
Right.
The HDI looks at 2 specific things here. Expected years of schooling for a child entering the system today, and the mean years of schooling for adults who are currently in the population.
Let's look at expected years first.
The 2023 data shows that the expected years of schooling in Chile is 16.91 years. The global average is just 13.04.
That's a huge gap.
It's massive. So a Chilean child starting school today is expected to stay in the educational system almost 4 years longer than the global average. That takes them well beyond high school and into university or specialized vocational training.
And if you look at the mean years of schooling, which represents the reality of the current adult workforce right now, it is 11.77, 9 years in Chile. Compare that to the global average of just 8.77.
Which means the average Chilean adult has essentially completed high school, whereas the global average adult dropped out before even starting high school.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of national development, that gap in mean years fundamentally alters the economic destiny of a country.
How so?
A workforce with 11.3 years of education creates a completely different labor market than a workforce with 8.7 years. It allows an economy to transition away from basic resource extraction.
Like just digging copper out of the ground.
Right. It moves them away from low-skill manufacturing and allows them to move into services, technology, complex management. It makes the entire population more adaptable to technological shifts.
But there is a specific detail buried in this education data
Yeah.
that absolutely stopped me in my tracks when I was reading the sources.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
When you look at the expected years of schooling and break it down by gender, you see an amazing flip. In 1990, Chilean men were expected to go to school longer than women, which completely aligns with historical global norms.
Sadly, yes.
But by 2023, Chilean women actually have a higher expected education span than men. It's 17.18 years for women, compared to 16.66 years for men.
It is a remarkable data point.
But how does a society actually achieve that? That isn't just closing a gap. That is completely reversing a historical patriarchal trend.
It's a total paradigm shift.
Yeah. The cultural shift required to get to a point where a society actively expects its daughters to study longer than its sons is monumental.
Yeah.
What drove that?
It was a combination of targeted state policy and broader cultural modernization. The government heavily subsidized higher education and created targeted scholarship programs. And these programs disproportionately benefited young women who historically simply wouldn't have had the family funds to attend university.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, as the economy transitioned toward those service sectors we mentioned, the demand for university degrees spiked. And women aggressively seized those opportunities. But, as we'll discuss later, this incredible triumph in female education sets up one of the most glaring, frustrating paradoxes in the entire Chilean data set.
Oh, I can't wait to get to that. But before we do, we have to look at the third pillar, economic prosperity, the wealth machine.
Right?
The HDI measures this through gross national income, or GNI, per capita. And importantly, it is adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP. Can you briefly explain what PPP means in conversational terms, just so we aren't throwing economic jargon around?
Absolutely. Purchasing power parity is essentially an equalizer. If I tell you someone makes $20,000 a year, that means something completely different if they live in Manhattan versus if they live in a small village in Southeast Asia.
Right, the rent alone in Manhattan.
Exactly. PPP adjusts the income numbers so that we are comparing what a dollar actually buys in a local grocery store or housing market. It lets us compare the true standard of living across borders.
Perfect. So looking at the PPP adjusted GNI for 2023, Chile hit $28,047 per capita.
That's incredibly strong.
It is. The global average was 20,327. So they are outperforming the world average by nearly 40% in pure income.
Hmm.
But what is truly remarkable to me is how elastic the Chilean economy proved to be during the pandemic.
The bounce back.
Yeah, we just spent all that time earlier talking about the global battery degrading. Let's trace Chile's economic shock. In 2019, their GNI was roughly $27,495.
Okay.
In 2020, as the world locked down, copper prices fluctuated wildly and global trade stalled, their GNI took a brutal hit. It dropped all the way down to $24,752.
It was a severe, painful contraction of national wealth. But this is exactly where those long-term investments in the other two pillars, health and education, really pay off as macroeconomic shock absorbers.
How so? Connect those dots for me.
Think about it. An educated, healthy populace is inherently more adaptable. If your workforce has 11 years of education, they have the digital literacy to pivot to remote work more effectively when lockdowns happen.
Because they know how to use computers and software.
Exactly. And because they are fundamentally healthier, the healthcare system doesn't collapse entirely, allowing parts of society to continue functioning. Because of that underlying human resilience, the Chilean economy demonstrated massive elasticity.
They bounced right back.
By 2023, their GNI didn't just slowly recover to the 2019 baseline, it exceeded it, rebounding to over $28,000.
Okay, so let's summarize the baseline here. When you aggregate an 81-year life expectancy, nearly 17 years of expected schooling, and a highly resilient $28,000 per capita income, you get that stellar 0.878 HDI score.
You get the image of a nation that has truly conquered the traditional metrics of development.
The rapid economic rebound, supported by health and education, is the core pillar keeping Chile highly competitive on the global stage.
On paper, looking purely at the X-ray, it is a masterclass in development.
But, and there's always a but in these deep dives.
There always is.
If everything is such a miracle, if everyone is living to 81 and making $28,000, why were there massive fiery social protests in the streets of Santiago a few years ago? People don't take to the streets, banging pots and pans, completely shutting down the capital, and demanding a new constitution if everything is perfect. Which tells me we are missing something crucial in this baseline data.
We are missing a tremendous amount, and this is exactly why we cannot rely solely on the standard HDI X-ray. And national average is a really dangerous thing. It smooths over the cracks.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think of it this way. If a billionaire walks into a dive bar with 9 broke people, on average, everyone in that bar is a multimillionaire.
Right, but that's definitely not the reality for the 9 guys at the bar.
Exactly. The average lies. To see the reality in Chile, we need to apply our second lens. We need to upgrade from the X-ray to the MRI.
Here is where it gets really interesting. We are now going to look at the inequality-adjusted HDI, the IHDI.
The MRI.
Right. We take that gleaming 0.878 score, and we mathematically penalize it based on how unevenly that health, education, and wealth are actually distributed across the population.
And the results are eye-opening.
When we apply that penalty, the illusion of perfection shatters. Chile's score drops violently from 0.878 down to 0.723.
That is a severe drop. It represents an overall loss of 17.65% of Chile's human development potential, purely because of inequality.
Almost 20% just wiped out.
Now, to be fair to Chile, we should note that the global average loss due to inequality is even higher. It's at 21.96%. So Chile is technically doing better than the world average at managing inequality.
But a 17.65% loss is still a massive drag on a society.
Oh, absolutely. It means nearly a fifth of their developmental achievements are locked away from the broader population.
I want to use an analogy here to visualize what's actually happening to their score. It reminds me of that old farming concept, Liebig's law of the minimum, often called the wooden bucket effect.
Oh, I love this analogy.
Imagine a wooden barrel made of several vertical wooden planks. The barrel itself represents the total human development of a country. The water you pour into it represents the benefits of health, education, and wealth. Now, if all the wooden planks are perfectly equal in height, the barrel holds a maximum amount of water. But if even one plank is cut short, it doesn't matter how high the other planks are.
The water just spills out over the lowest plank.
Exactly. The bucket can only ever hold as much water as its shortest piece of wood.
That is a fantastic way to visualize the IHDI. And the beauty of this specific data is that it allows us to look exactly at the individual planks of Chile's barrel to see exactly where the leak is occurring, because inequality isn't a monolith.
Right. So let's check the first plank. Inequality in life expectancy.
The data shows it is incredibly well controlled. The inequality penalty for health is only 4.59%.
Only 4.59.
Yeah. This means that in Chile, generally speaking, whether you are rich or poor, your access to life-extending health interventions is relatively equitable. The public health system is holding the water.
Okay, what about the second plank, education?
Also remarkably strong. Inequality in education is only 5.99%.
That's also really low.
It is. It aligns with what we discussed earlier about the sheer volume of years people spend in school. The state has done an excellent job of ensuring that basic and secondary education are widely accessible across completely different socioeconomic strata.
So health is equitable, education is equitable, but we still have an overall 17.65% loss, which brings us to the third plank, the shortest plank in the bucket.
Income.
Income. The data shows that inequality in income in Chile is a staggering 37.74%.
That is a gaping hole in the barrel.
That's nearly 40%.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this specific statistical makeup low inequality in health and education, combined with massive inequality in income, creates an incredibly combustible societal dynamic.
How so?
Think about the story this tells. It is a society that successfully provides its citizens with equal access to schools to get smart and hospitals to get healthy. But then it offers them deeply unequal access to the wealth generated by that healthy, educated populace.
I want you, the listener, to just pause and imagine the psychological reality of that for a moment. Think about your own paycheck.
Yeah, put yourself in their shoes.
Imagine looking at your pay stub, knowing you spent 16 years in the educational system, knowing you were putting in the exact same grueling hours as the executive upstairs, but 40% of the economic value you generate is siphoned off to the very top.
It's infuriating.
If you are uneducated, sick, and poor, you might tragically view your poverty as an inevitability. Like, it's just the way the world is.
Yeah.
But if you are healthy, capable, ambitious, and highly educated,
Yeah.
and you enter the workforce only to find you can't afford rent in Santiago.
That doesn't feel like fate.
No, that feels like a rigged system. It breeds a profound, simmering frustration.
Exactly. And this isn't just abstract sociology we're talking about. This is the exact data that explains the protests you mentioned earlier.
The ones shutting down the Capitol.
Yes. The millions of people on the streets of Santiago weren't driven by a lack of basic necessities, like they might have been in 1990. They were driven by a demand for dignity and a fair share of the prosperity that they themselves were building. The 37.74% income inequality is the hidden tax that undermines the social contract, no matter how high the overall HDI goes.
It's a fascinating paradox. A highly developed nation that is simultaneously highly unequal in its wealth distribution. But unfortunately, income isn't the only area where we see a paradox in the Chilean data.
No, it isn't.
Let's shift our focus and put on our third lens, the gender paradox. We're going to look at the Gender Development Index, the GDI, and the Gender Inequality Index, the GII.
And much like the overall HDI, the story starts with some undeniable hard-won triumphs.
It really does. If we look at the Gender Inequality Index, which measures the loss of achievement specifically due to gender disparities, Chile has made breathtaking progress.
Let's look at the numbers.
In 1990, Chile's GII was a highly unequal 0.508. Fast forward to 2023, and that number has plummeted to an incredibly progressive 0.102.
That is a massive drop.
That places Chile 33rd globally in terms of gender equality, which significantly outperforms its overall HDI rank of 76. They've clearly made reducing gender discrimination a systemic priority.
And the specifics of how they drove that number down are incredible, specifically in two areas, health and political empowerment.
Let's talk about health first. Let's look at maternal mortality.
Okay. In 1990, 57.7 women died per 100,000 live births in Chile. Today, that number has been crushed down to just 15.03.
Just 15.
To give you some perspective on how good that is, the global average is over 216 deaths per 100,000 live births.
Wow.
Chile has essentially eliminated the statistical danger of childbirth compared to the global baseline.
But how do you pull that off in a country stretching across mountains and deserts? I mean, logistically, how do you get care to these remote regions?
It requires immense coordinated logistical effort. It means establishing universal access to prenatal care. It means ensuring that almost all births, regardless of how remote the village is, are attended by skilled health personnel.
Not just a local midwife, but a trained professional.
Exactly. It means having emergency obstetric care readily available and creating transport networks to get women to hospitals quickly if something goes wrong. It is a testament to valuing female life at the most vulnerable moments.
And those triumphs extend beyond physical safety, right? They reach into the halls of power. In 1990, as Chile was transitioning back to democracy after a dictatorship, women held a mere 7.2% of parliamentary seats.
It was a complete boys' club.
A total boys' club. Today, women's share of parliamentary seats has exploded to 32.6%.
That is a fundamental rewiring of who makes the laws and sets the national priorities. Having a third of the legislature be female changes the entire conversation around social policy.
Okay, so let's synthesize this. Maternal mortality is extremely low. Political representation is surging. And remember, we already established earlier that Chilean women are expected to stay in school longer than men
Mm-hmm.
17.18 years, and they live 4 years longer than men.
Right.
So if women are healthier, more educated, and increasingly holding political power, you would naturally assume their overall gender development index rank would be stellar
You
then.
would definitely assume that. But this is where the data delivers a shock. Despite all these massive leaps forward, Chile's GDI rank is a lagging 101 out of 194 countries.
Wait, 101?
Yes, they're in the bottom half of the global rankings. It is a glaring, frustrating discrepancy.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How does a country rank 33rd in reducing gender inequality, but 101st in actual gender development?
Yeah.
What is the invisible barrier here?
The data points to one massive, undeniable problem: the labor force. We've hit the last mile problem of gender equality.
Let's look at the labor force participation rate. In Chile, 71.4% of adult men are actively in the labor force. But for women, it is stuck at 52.04%.
That is a 19% gap in workforce participation.
Nearly half of the adult female population is outside the formal labor market.
It's astounding.
It makes no sense from a pure economic optimization standpoint. Let me use an analogy here. Imagine a country spends 17 years paying for an elite athlete to train.
Okay.
They give her the base medical care. She lives to be 83. She is top of her class in every event. And then the day the Olympics actually start, the country just shrugs and says, actually, you can't compete, stay home.
It's a massive waste of potential.
Why is there a 19% gap? We just proved education isn't the problem. They're out-educating the men.
Which means the problem is deeply cultural and structurally invisible. Education alone hasn't fixed it because a university degree doesn't automatically build an affordable childcare center in your neighborhood.
Right.
A diploma doesn't erase the deeply ingrained traditional societal expectations that women must shoulder the vast majority of unpaid domestic labor and elder care. Education doesn't dismantle the subtle systemic biases in corporate hiring practices or promotion structures.
So it's the invisible infrastructure keeping them home.
Exactly. This 19% gap represents a massive reservoir of untapped economic potential.
So you have this highly educated workforce that is completely sidelined by cultural architecture.
Exactly. If Chile could just bring female labor force participation up to the level of men, the surge in GDP, the boost in tax revenue, and the spike in national innovation would be astronomical. But it requires tearing down the invisible barriers that keep women at home despite their degrees.
So to recap the journey so far, we have a country that has conquered longevity in education, but struggles with a 37% income inequality tax and a 19% female labor force gap.
It's a deeply complex, nuanced picture of human development.
It is. But now we have to introduce the final variable, the rule change on the racetrack that we talked about in the very beginning.
The big reveal.
Yes, we're going to put on our fourth lens, Section 5, the Earth's invoice. We're going to look at the planetary pressures-adjusted HDI, the PHDI. And this brings us all the way back to the hook of today's deep dive, the green reveal.
This is where the Chilean data goes from being a fascinating regional case study to being globally vital.
Why is that?
Historically, the graph comparing human development to carbon emissions looks like a perfect, unavoidable staircase. As a country gets richer, as its people live longer and buy more cars and consume more manufactured goods, their carbon footprint explodes.
They burn more stuff.
Right. The traditional highly developed nations, the US, Canada, parts of Europe, they achieved their high HDI by essentially mortgaging the planet's future. They burned incredibly cheap, dirty fossil fuels to build their wealth.
Right. And under the old rules of the global race, that was perfectly fine. Nobody penalized you for it.
The judges didn't care about the track.
Exactly. But when the UN introduced the PHDI to actually penalize countries for that ecological destruction, the traditional powerhouses tanked. Their adjusted scores plummeted because their carbon and material footprints were so astronomically high.
But let's look at Chile.
When we adjust Chile's impressive 0.878 HDI for its carbon emissions and material footprint, the score only drops by 10.7%.
That is a remarkably small penalty.
It is. And that relatively small penalty is what catapults them from rank 46 globally all the way up to rank 16.
Let's dig into the specific data to see why their penalty is so small compared to Western nations. Chile's CO2 emissions are only 3.937 tons per capita.
Okay, what's the baseline for that?
To put that in perspective, the global average, which includes dozens of incredibly poor non-industrialized nations, is 4.536 tons per capita.
Wait, really?
Yes, think about that. Chile is a wealthy, highly developed nation with a $28,000 per capita income, yet it emits significantly less carbon per person than the global average.
That is wild. They're rich, but they emit less than the global average.
And their material footprint, which measures the raw materials extracted globally to meet their domestic consumption demands, is 14.643 tons per capita, which is remarkably controlled for a high-income nation.
They completely break the historical rule. They have somehow decoupled economic and human development from massive ecological destruction. But how, again, I want to push back. Are they just outsourcing their dirty manufacturing to other countries, or is there a genuine structural difference here?
There is a genuine structural difference, and it is a mix of geographical luck and aggressive policy.
Hmm.
This raises an important question. Is the traditional Western model of high-emission development actually a failure? For decades, developing nations were told they had to follow the dirty, fossil fuel-heavy path to get rich.
Burn coal, build factories.
Right. Chile proves that is a lie. Geographically, they hit the jackpot for renewables. The Atacama Desert in the north has the highest solar irradiance on the planet.
Oh, wow.
It is literally the best place on Earth to generate solar power. And the Patagonia region in the south has fierce, consistent winds, perfect for wind energy.
So they have the natural resources, but you still have to build the grid to harness it.
Exactly, and that is the policy triumph. They have made concerted, aggressive efforts to green their energy grid and transition toward a more sustainable extraction model, even in their heavy copper and lithium mining sectors. They are replacing coal plants with massive solar fields.
So they are providing their citizens with extreme longevity, top-tier education, and solid wealth, all without putting a massive dent in the Earth's biosphere. Returning to our racetrack analogy, they are running incredibly fast on track, but they are wearing specially designed shoes that don't tear up the asphalt.
It is the holy grail of modern economics.
It is. But as we've seen throughout this deep dive, they are doing this while leaving a huge chunk of their wealth concentrated at the very top and leaving half their highly educated female workforce sidelined.
It is an imperfect miracle.
Which perfectly transitions us to the final part of our deep dive, the roadmap to true progress. We've synthesized a massive amount of data today. We've looked through all four lenses.
We covered a lot of ground.
If we had to lay out the four forward-looking pillars for Chile's next decade, how they move from just a high statistical score to actual holistic progress, what does that look like?
Based purely on the data we've looked at, the roadmap is incredibly clear. Pillar 1, health and education.
Okay, they're already doing great there.
They are, but they must maintain their high investment, and the focus has to shift from quantity to quality. They've succeeded in getting kids into desks for 17 years. Now they need to ensure the education a child receives in a public rural school is of the exact same high caliber as a private school in wealthy neighborhoods of Santiago.
Right. That directly addresses the root of future inequality.
Exactly. Pillar 2 is obvious based on our bucket analogy earlier. Wealth distribution.
They have to directly tackle that 37.74% income inequality penalty.
You cannot sustain a highly educated, healthy, modern democracy if 40% of the economic gains are locked away from the people generating them. Tax reform, stronger social safety nets, and more equitable wage structures have to be the priority to stop that bucket from leaking.
Makes total sense.
Pillar 3 is economic gender parity. They must close that 19% female labor force gap. This isn't just a social justice issue. It is the most obvious low-hanging fruit for explosive national economic growth.
So what's the fix?
Build the childcare infrastructure. Change the cultural narratives around unpaid labor and unleash that highly educated female workforce into the economy. It is a dual win for GDP growth and social fairness.
And finally, Pillar 4, green leadership. Chile needs to fiercely protect its low-emission advantage. They are currently ranked 16th in the world when planetary pressures are considered.
They have the opportunity to become the undisputed global template for sustainable development. As the rest of the highly developed world struggles paying massive economic costs to painfully decarbonize their old grids, Chile is already perfectly positioned to lead the green economy of the 21st century.
And if we bring this all back to you, the listener, true progress, whether for a nation of 19 million people or for you navigating your own life and career, is never defined by a single metric.
Absolutely not.
You can't just look at the balance in your bank account to determine if your life is successful, just like we can't just look at GNI to judge a country.
Exactly. If you are wealthy, but you are destroying your physical and mental health to get there, your personal planetary pressure, is that progress?
No.
If you are highly educated and successful, but you treat the people around you unequally, is that success?
Right. True progress requires health, it requires fairness, it requires integrating all your potential, and crucially, it requires sustainability. You have to be able to run your personal race without destroying the track beneath your own feet.
That is the profound human story hidden inside this stack of demographic spreadsheets. The data from 1990 to 2023 isn't just a collection of numbers. It is a permanent ledger of the choices a society makes.
What do we value?
Right. Who do we protect? What kind of future are we willing to pay for?
We've gone from the raw survival metrics of 1990, navigated the brittle supply chains of the pandemic shock, explored the triumphs in lifespan and the structural failures in wealth distribution, and finally, we arrived at the green reveal that fundamentally changes how we view the global hierarchy. It has been an incredible journey through the data.
It has. And I want to leave the listener with one final paradigm-shifting idea to mull over as we close.
Let's hear it.
For the last 50 years, our global vocabulary has relied heavily on the terms developed and developing nations. And we base those terms almost purely on infrastructure and wealth.
Right. The old rules of the race.
But if a highly developed nation is ecologically bankrupt, if their carbon emissions are so high that they are actively destroying the very biosphere that all human life relies on, shouldn't they be reclassified as developing in terms of sustainability?
Wow.
Perhaps countries like Chile, which are finding ways to balance high human development with low planetary pressure, aren't just catching up to the first world. Perhaps they are actually inventing the next world.
That is a brilliant thought to end on. If the rules of the race change, the winners change. I want to thank you, the listener, for running this deep dive with us today. The next time you see a headline about economic growth or a politician touting a new development metric, I encourage you to look closer.
Look at the internal data.
Ask yourself what the hidden tax is. Ask who's being left out of the labor force. And most importantly, ask if they're destroying the track just to win the sprint. Stay curious, keep questioning the metrics of success, and we will see you on the next deep dive.